Today on the show, we tie together three topics that at first glance appear unrelated: thrifting, composting, and philanthropic advising. The threads that connect each of these are minimizing waste, improving efficiency, and serving communities. Perhaps one word for this is stewardship. Everything that we have is a gift from God. When we give our stuff to a thrift store instead of throwing it away, we extend its life. When we take our food waste and compost it to help new food grow, we use creativity to bring renewal. And when a philanthropic advisor helps a client give wealth or invest in social impact companies, the money is put to productive use. My guest today, Tony Whitter, once described his vocation to me in these terms: helping people steward what God has given them through thrifting, composting, and philanthropic advising. He was the executive director of a social good thrift store chain in Kansas City for 14 years. Now he's the CEO of Compost Collective KC, and he's also a simple charity philanthropic advisor. Tony is a delight to work with and collaborate with. He's thoughtful, kind, and authentic, and I'm excited to be able to have him on the show today. Join me for a conversation about thrifting, composting, and philanthropy, and what they can teach us about stewardship. If you are listening to this podcast, this is your show. So as always, please send me your thoughts, your questions, and suggestions at brian@simplecharity.org. And if the show is helpful, please click a 5-star rating in your podcast app. This little action really helps get our show out to more listeners. You can also click like and subscribe if you're listening on Spotify or Apple or YouTube. I'm Brian Grasso. This is the Simple Charity Podcast, a show about learning to love generously like Jesus. I'm so glad you're with us today. Hi, Tony Whitter. Welcome to the Simple Charity Podcast.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to participate.
Tony, what are you grateful for today?
You know, I have a lot of wonderful things going on, Brian. It's an absolutely beautiful day here in Kansas City today. My younger son, Stephen, is getting ready to graduate college from the University of Kansas next month. I'm grateful for that. At 1:15 p.m. today, I get to teach a class of third graders for 35 minutes. So I'm really excited about doing that. It'll be a blast to be around them at Guadalupe Elementary School in Kansas City, Missouri.
That is so fun. What are you teaching these third graders? Give us the sneak peek.
So I'm teaching them a little bit about composting. I'm going to talk to them about food waste and how food waste can get turned into really cool compost and how people use it to grow really awesome food, and talk to them just a little bit about soil and bugs and why they're all really good things. And if I have a few minutes, I'll read a book called Compost Stew. And I have a compost snack, if I'm allowed to serve them a snack, with some pudding, gummy worms, and crushed Oreos. So we'll see how it all goes. It should be fun.
Tony, you would be an excellent special guest for a third grade class. You're coming fully prepared with the gummy worms and the compost. I'm imagining like little plastic cups filled with this pudding and wow.
Exactly.
Amazing.
That's right. Eat what's going on in the earth.
Eat what's going on in the earth. This is a actually wonderful bridge towards our topic today. We're going to talk on the Simple Charity Podcast about composting. My goal for today, among other things, is to learn something new about composting. So we'll see if you're capable of delivering on that promise. But broader than that, we're going to talk about this idea of stewardship. And really, there are three contexts in your life, Tony. You are a simple charity philanthropic advisor. You are the leader of a company that does composting. And you are the former executive director of a network of thrift stores in the Kansas City area that supported local nonprofits. And so I think there's these three areas of thrifting, composting, and giving that we've talked about all fall under this umbrella of stewardship. And so that's the big idea for today, but we're going to look at it from a couple different lenses. Um, but that word stewardship gets used a lot these days. It's all over kind of the faith driven movement, and it shows up on my LinkedIn, feed quite often. What does the word stewardship mean to you?
So for me, I think stewardship is recognizing that things are not ours, they're the Lord's, and that's where it starts. And so I want to do what I can to take care of the earth, take care of material things, take care of money, because it's not mine, and I'm
Mm,
borrowing it from a future generation, something that's God's, and so I want to do a good job of taking care of it.
hmm. Yeah, what does it mean to take care of something? Like, what does it mean to, like, I'm thinking about if I were to borrow someone's car, and
Mm.
I'm like driving on a road trip in someone else's car. Um, eh, you know, and so I'm kind of stewarding the car. How would I approach taking care of the car,
Mhm.
yeah, what does that mean to take care of something?
Yeah. Well, first thing, recognize that it's not yours.
Hmm.
And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
that brings a higher standard of care potentially.
Mm,
Um, and stewarding things that aren't ours, it's selfless.
hmm.
Um, we're going to take care of them. I think, you can start out with kids when they're young. They age out of a toy or a piece of clothing. And you start teaching them that instead of throwing it away, you can find a home by donating it. And kids can
Hmm.
begin to grasp the concept of donating at a very young age. And really, that's where it starts is reuse. This doesn't
Hmm.
have to go in the trash. This can go to somebody else who can use it if it's in good condition. And it starts there, and then it just keeps getting more sophisticated, hopefully, as we get older.
Yeah.
Through stewarding our assets or generational legacy or all those things that take place when we
Mm,
get later in our life.
yeah. Yeah, I think there's this element of intentionality. There's also this element of creativity of
Hmm.
how can this be reused? How can this
Hmm.
the life of this, you know, material good or asset or whatever
Hmm.
be extended
Yeah.
and productive and how it serves others.
Hmm.
Okay, well, let's start with thrifting as our first category of stewardship.
Sure.
So tell us about Blessings Abound.
Sure.
What is this organization, and when and how did you get involved?
Sure. And as I start that, I just want to mention you were talking about reuse, and just one small example popped in my head. Sometimes people wonder, what can I do with an empty pill bottle? Okay. And so that's one of those little items that a lot of times they're going to look at and think, can this be used by anybody? Well, there's a really wonderful homeless organization in Kansas City that has vans equipped that go to all the homeless encampments 4 nights a week. And they use pill bottles to fill with small amounts of liquids that can be used as hygiene items, for example, for those at homeless encampments. So, it's
Hmm,
just one of those little examples of something that we forget that it can be used. We don't need to throw it away. So anyway, just as there's a million of those, but that's one little reminder. That's kind of what zero waste is all about, is before you throw this away, what can happen to this particular item? And I think as a society, we have a lot to learn in that area. So blessings abound. Um, I got into Blessings Abound very circumstantially. I was on a church staff many years ago at a Lutheran church, and I had heard of Blessings Abound. I had not been there, um, only knew basics about it. And it was a young organization, approximately 3 years old, struggling to a certain extent. And I was asked to consider being the executive director there. First time I walked into Blessings Abound, I had actually never been into a thrift store before. And I didn't grow up thrifting. I grew up in a small community. It just wasn't something I was very familiar with. So the first time I went into Blessings Abound was associated with an interview, and I went into the back room and I saw a volunteer ironing a used shirt. And when I was watching this lady iron this used shirt, it just caught my attention that somebody would take such great care over something that someone else had discarded and
Mm,
then handle it multiple times and then put it on a rack for sale. At that time was $3 for this shirt. And so the volunteer community caught my attention right away, and I was immediately engaged in them and their passion to serve together in a joyful way. And that's how I became engaged initially, and then just started the process of developing it as a ministry.
uh, so okay, so I'm almost satisfied with that story, but you did become the executive director and lead it for I think 12 years. So how did
14.
how 14? Okay. So how did you go from seeing the volunteer ironing the shirt to leading this organization?
Yeah, so I went through, an interview process, and it was something that, at that point in my life, I was in a discernment phase. I had been on a church staff. I wanted to serve and wanted to serve as I felt called to serve. And that's what I felt like God was telling me to do at that time. And it wasn't something I was seeking out or had a particular interest in that area. Um, love the idea of being an executive director, love the nonprofit community, love the opportunity to do ministry. And then it
Mm,
was, what does ministry mean in the thrift world? So it just launched this process of developing a volunteer community, serving together with joy. The mission that we were supporting, we were a Christian nonprofit dedicated to serving those in need through the resale and redistribution of donated items. So
mm,
Blessings Abound was formed to be a funder of the two organizations that started Blessings Abound. They each chipped in $20,000 to open the store. When I got involved, it was a small group of volunteers. The store was struggling. And so it was just something that was calling for effort. And so we started putting in a lot of effort, growing our donations, growing our volunteer base, learning how to do retail thrift, and all the things that went along with it, beginning to staff. When I started at Blessings Bound, I was the only paid employee. Everybody else was a volunteer. And when I left 14 years later, we had 80 employees and 200 or
wow.
so regular volunteers. We had entertained, easily 10,000 plus people through groups. And it was just a really, really fun experience and a unique way to do ministry.
Hmm. And it also grew to multiple locations throughout the Kansas City area. So
Mhm.
you have these multiple thrift stores now. And then tell us about the impact of the grant making that you were able to do from the profits of these thrift stores.
Sure. So when we got started, the store was just making literally a few dollars, and then we just started, you know, scratching and clawing and working our way forward. Again, increasing all those groups that I talked about, donations, volunteers, and then working our way forward. We started giving away $5,000 a month, and then we started giving away $10,000 a month. And I remember a volunteer came up to me when we were giving away $10,000 a month, and she said, Tony, it's big enough. You know, giving away $10,000 a month is fine. We don't need any more clothes. Let's just call it good and just keep it at this level. And I said, well, I don't know. I don't know what God has planned for this ministry, but let's just see. I think we should probably be thinking about what does it look like if it's twice the size it is now, not what it is now. So then we were giving away $20,000 a month, and then we were giving away $50,000 a month. And then in 2016, um, we had a circumstance, and I know your generosity story about a first donation that you coordinated and how it was used. And we were giving away money that was being used in a lot of wonderful ways. But there was a situation where we gave away some money and found out that the organization's their reserve was going up um, consistent with the money we were giving them. And so we said, well, maybe they're not in a position to grow at this time. So we adjusted that and started what we call the Blessings Fund, which worked a little bit like a small family foundation would work. We didn't have the governance of a family foundation, of course, but we started accepting grants from local nonprofits in the Kansas City area. Everything we were doing was in human services. So we were trying to help people in need. Could be food, counseling, anything related, reentry ministry, whatever the case may be. So we started that process, and then not knowing really that it was a thing, we developed a giving strategy, and on our own, sort of in our own world, and looked at it sort of like an investment portfolio and said, we probably don't want to give all the money we generate to food pantries. We probably don't want to give it all to reentry ministry. Let's spread it out like we would an investment portfolio and see what makes sense for the Kansas City area. So we were giving $50,000 a month to an organization called Metro Lutheran Ministry, which does a lot of wonderful work in the Kansas City area, food, case management, housing, rapid rehousing, a lot of wonderful programs. And we started giving money to an organization called Operation Breakthrough, which is an amazing school for low-income children in the Kansas City area. And then it just kept building. And then over time, we were giving set contributions to 8 different nonprofits in the Kansas City area every month. So we had $117,000 going out a month. And then we were setting aside money to run through this Blessings Fund to accept grants. The average grant that we distributed through that fund was about $16,000 per grant. So we worked our way up to giving away approximately $2 million a year. Then during the time I was there, we gave away about $14 million to local organizations. And it was fun to see a few of those organizations in particular develop with that funding. So maybe they started out as a $500,000 nonprofit and then ended up as a $2 million nonprofit, or they, developed their network extensively in the community. We supported Blessings Abound supported a wonderful furniture bank in Kansas City called Flourish. And they have partnerships with 90 plus nonprofits, and case managers bring individuals that are transitioning into an apartment to the furniture bank, and then they receive housewares, linens, furniture, everything they need to set up an apartment. So in all those cases, it was just wonderful to see those organizations develop just in part from the funding that was coming from Blessings Abound, and then being able to turn around and share those stories with the volunteers so that they knew when they were sorting clothes and doing all this physical labor, which is difficult. Working in the back room of a thrift store is difficult. Being a volunteer cashier when you have 700 to 1,100 customers a day coming in your thrift store. And most of them are happy, but not all of them are happy. A lot of them don't understand the ministry. They're just there to shop. And so you have all those normal retail things about price sensitivity and customer behavior and all those things, and volunteers that do all that for the sake of a mission. It's unbelievable. And they would come back week after week. It's not like they showed up on a Saturday morning from 9 to 11 a.m. and it was a one and done. We had volunteers that came 2 or 3 times a week every week. When we grew and had a larger staff, there were days when you had bad weather, and when you have bad weather, employees call in, volunteers would still show up.
Wow.
And their dedication is just unrivaled. And the old saying is there's nothing greater than the heart of a volunteer. And man, I saw that all the time at Blessings Abound. It was just incredible.
That's amazing. What lessons did you learn, Tony, as you are distributing these millions of dollars? And you said, you had that negative experience of, hey, is this actually making any impact at all, or is this organization stocking it in their cash reserves? But what other lessons did you learn about efficient giving, about effective philanthropy,
Hmm.
as you were not only running and growing this
Hmm.
retail business, managing
Hmm.
these volunteers, but
Hmm.
also essentially doing the functions of a family foundation?
Sure. Well, and by the way, to the credit of the organization that I made reference to, that money isn't sitting there today. It was deployed in ministry over time. I think it was simply a matter of we were providing funds to them faster than they were prepared or had the capacity to handle. So, but time heals all, and over time things worked out well. As far as the nonprofit community, I feel like I know the nonprofit community in Kansas City pretty well, and there's a few common threads. I think nonprofits, when they have issues, they have common issues. It's not uncommon for a nonprofit to have some issue related to the board. It's not uncommon for a nonprofit to have some relationship or some difficulty with strategic development or fundraising related, development related things. It's not uncommon for a nonprofit, particularly a faith based nonprofit, to have some difficulty with what I refer to as the business of ministry. I have this passion. This is what I want to do. I'm desperate to help people, but I get blinded by my passion and miss some of the development things that need to be done around me. And going from a doer to an orchestra director and all those things that have to take place as a nonprofit develops. So I think to be an effective giver, um, impact is important. We really need to see what's happening after the fact. And it's difficult for a nonprofit because when they're handing out food regularly at a food pantry, or when they're providing case management services every day, or they are helping people get into rapid rehousing programs every day, or they're educating young children of poverty every day, it's not easy to show specific impact to the dollars you gave. Okay. And so we have to have a good balance between trust based philanthropy and, that nonprofit colonoscopy where we probably get more information than we need. Okay. And we definitely leaned more towards the trust based philanthropy side. So we said, the funds that we provide are unrestricted and you use them as you need to do them. And we're going to watch, your work. We did stay engaged in a way, but we didn't try and micromanage or be involved to that level of degree. We had several volunteers at Blessings Abound that also volunteered for other nonprofits that we supported. So it wasn't a requirement or necessarily a common thread, but it also wasn't uncommon. So impact, um, engagement, leadership is so important, and particularly for the smaller organizations, they're faith-based. Who's their leader? Where are they going? Are they a one-person show? Are they prepared to scale or capable of adding capacity if the need exists? Some nonprofits are mom and pops and probably should stay that way just because of what they do. I'm on the board of a small prison ministry, and it's all volunteer. They have 80 to 90 volunteers that go into 5 area prisons that are relatively close to the Kansas City area. There's really no reason for that organization to add a lot of structure. They don't need to become prison fellows. They're very effective and efficient at what they do. The executive director has a full-time job, um, that's in a foster program, very large foster program. But
Mm,
his passion is prison ministry. He has a very strong testimonial, and so at night, this is what he's doing, and rallies these volunteers to go into prisons, provide prayer support, do Bible studies, all these wonderful faith-based activities. They have a great newsletter that's all based on articles written by volunteers, and then the newsletter is placed on Adovo, that platform that gets it to 1 million prisoners in the country. So, that's just
mm,
one example of a nonprofit that's faith-based, wonderful mission. They don't really need to get larger
yeah.
or very much larger than they are.
Yeah. Tony, I mean, so much wisdom and so much we could dig into farther. You use the phrase trust-based philanthropy.
Hmm.
People who follow philanthropy and news about philanthropy will know that that's been really popularized by Mackenzie Scott. And her
Hmm.
approach has been to due diligence organizations and then
Hmm.
write these massive checks of
Hmm.
$1 million
Right.
or
Uh-huh.
and she's given more money faster than I
50.
think anyone ever. Yes. But I'm reminded as you share your approach that there is a continuum from, you know, fully trust based to, you know, frankly, donors not giving up a lot of control and pulling
Right.
the puppeteering the nonprofits through a
Hmm.
system of, restricted grants and
Hmm.
extensive reporting
Hmm.
requirements and things that I think honestly can go really awry because
Yes.
donors do not have the same information about the problem,
Hmm.
about the programs that the nonprofit staff do. And so, but
Right.
I'm reminded of the Ronald Reagan quote, and I wonder if this is a good way to to summarize the kind of healthy middle ground here, and that's trust but verify. Did you know I was gonna say that? You looked like
I
you were
did.
expecting me to say that.
I
Yeah,
did.
yeah, yeah. I mean, trust
That's
but
right.
verify. I mean,
That's right.
I think um to take it kind of in a philosophical economics I studied economics in college. I took some
Uh-huh.
classes around that were a little bit more philosophical, and one of the things that I came to believe in college is that all contracts are imperfect. And
Mhm.
so, because all contracts are imperfect, we actually need a society with virtue where people trust each other and are trustworthy. And
Mhm.
you can't contract your way into an efficient and effective system because contracts are imperfect and because there's asymmetric information. And I think this is absolutely true in philanthropy. Like,
Mhm.
even if you write that restricted grant MOU and say, this is exactly how
Mhm.
you have to use this money, that's not going
Mhm.
to be a perfect contract. There are kind of cheat points, there are things that might not make sense, and there's asymmetric information. So, all that to say, I think trust is necessary as a way to do this work, but also we have to do our due diligence and be
Mhm.
wise and offer that loving support. I think actually lovingly supporting nonprofits is a form of accountability.
Mhm.
It is a way to say, hey, I'm showing up, I'm paying attention.
Mhm.
um, and I think that also not only helps nonprofits improve, but helps
Mhm.
them to stay on the straight and narrow, so to
Mhm.
speak, if there are temptations to kind of waver from their mission or from
Mhm.
best practices.
Mhm.
No questions at the end of that, just a long rant, but yeah.
Well, I totally agree, and I could share a number of stories there. But I think that I listened to two nonprofits talk recently. One was a $1 million profit, and the other one was a $10 million profit, and there was a mentoring going on there, which was just fun to sit and listen to. But the larger nonprofit was talking about restricted grants, was talking about how a nonprofit can develop into simply programming around their funding,
Yeah.
or they can have this dream and then stress every day about funding to meet their dream. Where am I going to get the money to meet my dream? And it's
Mm,
probably a little bit of a combination of both. But to a certain extent, if somebody really wants to fund something and it fits the mission, great, let them fund it and pursue that opportunity. But of course not if it took away from the core purpose of that organization. There are some bad work development programs out there, that
Hmm.
just are not done particularly well, in my personal opinion. And
How
so
can they be
if
bad? That's a hand up. That's a hand up, not a handout. I mean, that's what, their websites are probably saying right now. But what makes a work development program less than ideal?
well, if the only
Without getting
thing
into
you're off
specifics
so
of
if the only
specific
thing you're
organizations.
offering somebody is a $15 an hour job that's part-time without
Mm,
benefits and does not allow them to even maintain an apartment, I don't
yeah,
consider that a very good work development program.
yeah.
And so then, yes, you're giving them a job that they didn't have before. Maybe they're coming out of incarceration and
Hmm.
they need a break. Yes, you give them a break, but are you giving them a break that allows them to be sustainable? And we're going to talk about sustainability of the earth and all those things, but there's also sustainability of people, and people need to be able to sustain themselves. And I'm not saying every time I provided a job, I did that. I'm sure there were times where I didn't, because at Blessings Abound, we tried to sprinkle in some hiring in coordination with a recovery facility. So we tried to integrate ministry even into our staff. We had a number
Mm,
of professional experts in given areas. We also had individuals that, it was a win-win. We need help in an area. They were in recovery and were stable and needed an opportunity to work. And so in some cases in a recovery program, they can't work full time because the requirements of being in that program are demanding. They have classes they have to go to. They have to go to AA at night or celebrate recovery or whatever the case may be. And so, um, by participating in all the required activities, particularly if they're in a restrictive program, they may not have time to work full time. And so
yeah.
hopefully the recovery facility is working with them in such a way that part-time employment is sufficient. And from a mental health standpoint, that may be all they're ready for. They may
Hmm.
have been incarcerated, they're coming out, and they may only be ready to work 20 hours a week and just kind
Yeah.
of get their sea legs back again. And then gradually, as they become stable, um, they have um, a longer period of being sober. Then
Yep.
they're ready to work for a longer period of time. But take somebody in that environment, throwing them into a full-time job that is sustainable but has a lot of associated stress, maybe way more than they're ready for, and then they just relapse. And I've seen
Mm,
that many times. So.
hmm. Um, I love that Blessings Abound had this triple whammy of
Mhm,
impact. The first is that it was a business that raised money, that
mhm,
made money, and you distributed, you said $14 million of grants to local nonprofits as that serve vulnerable populations. So that's the one. That's the obvious one. The second,
mhm,
though, is what you just said. You're creating jobs and creating
mhm,
jobs for people who might have a hard time getting jobs otherwise. So there's
mhm,
impact there. You're actually impacting those people's lives. But this third one, and this is something I've really come to believe is true. I think thrift stores play a function of lowering the monthly expense bill of low income families.
mhm,
Because the people who shop at thrift stores, not all of them, obviously middle class and
mhm,
upper middle class people shop
mhm.
at thrift stores,
Right.
but you can go get a really good pair of pants. I pretty much
Mhm,
exclusively shop at thrift stores because of
mhm.
just who I am and who me and my wife are. It's like, and honestly, living where I live, thrift stores have such nice stuff. I mean, you go and
Yeah.
you get this like almost new, you know, Ralph Lauren shirt and it's $5 and the retail price would be $40, 30,
Mhm.
40.
Right.
And but I think that's actually a tremendous impact that thrift stores have.
Mhm.
It actually provides low income families a
Mhm.
place to shop and lower their
Absolutely.
expenses as well. So there's this like
Mhm.
triple whammy, and I think this is
Mhm.
gets to that idea of stewardship and also to this
Mhm.
idea of creativity.
Mhm.
Of
Yep.
here is a business model where we are not wasting anything. We're not wasting
Mhm.
the profits, we're not wasting the operational model, and we're not wasting actually the offering itself in terms of making a positive difference in
Mhm.
Kansas City. So
Absolutely.
yeah. All right. Well, let's go to the next
S
one. So that's or go ahead. Feel free to respond to that before we go on.
So, um, there are some interesting things going on in the thrift world, which is growing at a rate of 9 or 10% a year, and there are more
Wow.
thrift stores than ever. Um, 15 years ago, thrift is a little bit like what I see composting to be now.
Mm,
It's not brand new, but it's primarily innovators and early adopters that are composting, and it's not something that's mainstream. And thrift was obviously not new. You know, there were Salvation Army and Goodwill stores decades ago, but in the last 15, 20 years, thrift has become much more mainstream. We have kids now that have grown up shopping at thrift stores. It's an outing, it's a birthday party, it's all kinds of things that it didn't used to be. There are, in the Kansas City area now, probably 35 what I would consider to be large scale thrift store
wow.
operations, and it continues to grow. And so lots of things come out of that. Capitalism comes out of that. Um, we have price increases come out of that.
Mm,
So you'll hear from shoppers like you on a fairly regular basis that, you know, hey, this might be more expensive than it was at Walmart or some other retailer.
hmm.
So the pricing in thrift stores is beginning to gray with retail. A lot of thrift organizations are integrating online sales into their thrift organization. So we started online sales from scratch about 3 years ago.
You
Um,
have online sales?
yes.
Oh my gosh.
So fast forward when I left,
I didn't know that.
we had 2,000 things listed on eBay, and
Whoa.
we were, you know, selling anywhere from say 20 to 40 items a day online.
Mm,
And there are a lot of thrift organizations utilizing online sales for a couple of reasons. It could be things that they feel are more likely to be stolen at retail. Shrinkage is high in the thrift business, or it could be something that they know is clearly worth more. So you have a designer purse that's, you know, you'd sell at the thrift store for 20 bucks, you know, it's worth 100. So you sell it online for 60 or $80. And even with your online fees, you're still ahead, hopefully. So there are a lot of thrift organizations, and there's a lot of systems as well, a lot of thrift technology that's becoming very mainstream. And that thrift technology is smart. So has the capability now to integrate the sorting of items to say, you know, if we're going to, let's say, if you're using Google Lens, all right, so you're regularly taking pictures of things and then getting an idea of what they're worth. So imagine that happening on a rapid scale, such that you're determining in a very systematic fashion what should be sold online versus what should be sold in the store. And then there's you know, thrift stores have a whole back end about recycling the things that, you know, half of what you get, you can't sell, you know, so there's a lot of percentages that go into that. So what happens to all those items? They're not thrown away, they're recycled. There's a whole secondary market beyond thrift of items by the pound and what's happening in those. So there's a lot of interesting things going on in the thrift area. There are major retailers that are starting to look at how they can capture the value of their own items that become used, whether it's, you know, you're trading something in at Macy's or whatever the case may be. So large scale retailers are looking at that as well.
yeah. Okay, we're gonna move on to composting. But
Okay.
that was so delightful. That was so delightful. I I feel like if I ever write a book, I want to have a chapter that uses thrift, just the history of thrifting,
There you
and I
go.
could. I think that would be fascinating. That would be the kind of thing I would like to read 20 pages
Sure.
about. Um, let's talk about composting.
Sure.
And what is your current role? And just give us an overview, perhaps like you just did with thrifting, of
Mhm.
composting. You say this is kind of a newer industry in some ways. It's funny you said it like that, Tony, because I would make the same argument about philanthropic advising.
Right, exactly. Yeah,
But we'll get there. But give us like a 3 or 4 minute
sure,
rundown of what composting is and what your current work
sure.
is with composting.
Absolutely. So I currently run an organization called Compost Collective KC. We are Kansas City's curbside and commercial pickup service. So we focus on collections of food waste. And sometimes when people hear composting, they give me a blank look in the face and they think I'm dealing with manure. I don't. We pick up food waste. So that includes things like, coffee grounds, eggshells. Have you ever composted, Brian?
Yes. So my mom had
Okay.
the big thing that spins, and we
Oh,
would
okay.
go
A tumbler.
dump a tumbler. My mom had a tumbler, and it'd be
Okay,
stinky,
awesome.
and there was worms, and it was so fun as a kid. So
Okay,
fun.
great. Well, it doesn't have to smell if it's managed properly.
Well, then
So,
we were probably doing something wrong, which doesn't surprise me. But
there you go. So there is, there's a faith comparison or metaphor for all parts of composting, whether it's regeneration or, I'm kind of like food waste, and hopefully the Lord regenerates me through the forgiveness of my sins and turns me into something beautiful like compost. So um,
there's a death
organizations that
and
are involved.
resurrection. We
That's
just had
right.
Easter, but there is
That's right.
this
It's
death and
renewal.
resurrection. Yeah.
Yep. Renewal of the earth is a really beautiful thing. And it's just amazing that God gave us the capability to do it. So composting is ancient as an act. Okay. Centuries ago, people would have buried their food waste in the ground or obviously composted with manure or whatever the case may be, or, a cow grazing in a field. That is as natural of composting, as there is, and the life that goes into compost is ancient, and it's just using the earth the way it was intended to be used. So, God gave us this beautiful thing where we can take our food waste, you cut up a cantaloupe or your leftovers, or again, coffee grounds, eggshells, banana peels, all those sorts of things. And then you combine them with carbon materials, which would be ground up leaves, sticks, things of that nature, wood chips. And whether you're composting at home or using a curbside service or whatever you're doing, or your place of work, a commercial location is composting, a restaurant is collecting food scraps as they cook. Um, those are processed by roughly, just very generally speaking, about a 3-to-1 ratio of uh, of greens and or browns and greens, if you will. Browns being ground up leaves or wood chips or something, and greens, for example, being food waste. So that essential
Hmm.
process, along with, there are lots of different ways to compost. Some are most of them are aerobic in nature. There are ways to compost in anaerobic ways. Um, but in terms of composting it, over a period of time, could be 30 days, could be however long it took in your tumbler. Most of what we do is a larger scale, about a 5-month process. There's a really large processor in Kansas City that's the largest one in the Midwest. They work off generally about a 6-month process. And then when it's done, it turns into this beautiful soil amendment. That if I can show you, just
You brought
looks.
an example.
I have props, right? I have props, so it just looks like that, right?
Is this what
So
the third graders are getting this afternoon too?
if we get that far, yes. So, but this is amazing because of what it does to the earth that God gave us, and it's the way that God gave us to replenish the earth, refurbish the soil, and the ability to grow beautiful vegetables like these. This radish is a beautiful radish. There's asparagus starting to come out of the ground now, and in Kansas City farms and gardens. And I don't know where you are in your farms in Georgia, probably a little bit farther along. And it's Masters Weekend in Augusta, so you get to see all the magnolias and all that kind of stuff, but which is different. But the this compost operation is in coordination with a sister farm, and the sister farm is a regenerative farm, which means they
Oh, cool.
farm in a way that the soil was meant to be used. That means they don't till, they rotate crops, they don't use any chemicals on the farm, and they use as little irrigation as possible. They're not able to do it without any irrigation, but they use much less than in traditional farming mechanisms. So really, it's a closed loop. We use the phrase farm to table, table to farm. So we're collecting food scraps. They're turned into compost. 3/4 of the compost that we produce is used on the 13.5-acre urban farm in Kansas City, Missouri, which produces these beautiful vegetables. And they have an orchard there and other things, lots of different berries, and they grow probably 125 different items on the farm. And then neighbors and others are buying those, whatever the case may be. About 1/4 of the compost that's produced is donated in the community. So it could go to a church's raised bed or another nonprofit's raised bed. We had an organization come the other day and pick up 50 cubic yards of donated compost. It's a great little nonprofit called Food for the Cure. And they raise organic vegetables on their own, and then they distribute those to cancer patients that are at home or going to facilities where they're receiving regular treatment, like a dialysis center, for example. And there are sometimes people in those situations just don't have access to a lot of healthy food. So they're trying to provide an avenue to provide them healthy food in that situation.
There's a nonprofit in Atlanta I discovered recently that does that same thing, that delivers, good food, healthy food, good meals to people with chronic health conditions or with cancer. And
that's awesome.
So tell me about the business model. So these farms, are they the ones buying the main farm that you partner with? They're the ones that buy the compost, and that's how this organization makes money? Or what's the business model?
Sure. 80% in industry wide, 80% of the money in composting is made on the front end. So that's the drop off, or what's referred to in the industry as a tipping fee. So that means if you had a manufacturing facility or a restaurant or something, and you were taking your food waste to a processing center on your own or through a third party broker or whatever the case may be, you would be paying a tipping fee, for example, $100 a ton, to drop that off at the facility that will then process that food waste and turn it into a nutrient-rich compost. So that's where most of the money comes from. There is money in finished compost. We actually don't sell any compost. We use it all on the farm, or we donate it to the community. There are certainly ways to make money selling compost. You can sell a good healthy compost in bulk for, say, $50 a yard, as an example. Our current relationship in this system in Kansas City, that works well for what we do. We donate about 1/4 and use 3/4. And by the way, in this particular case, the farm and the compost operation are actually owned by the farmer couple. So these organizations are separate entities, but they go together. We're in the process of working with several other farmers to potentially set up compost operations on their farm so that we can produce more food waste compost in the Kansas City metro area that can be made available to smaller farmers in areas around the Kansas City metro. Because um, when you talk about soil quality, okay, some places have their soil may have too much clay, or it may have too much sand, or it might be great loam soil. But in a lot of cases, soil can be enriched and made more viable for growing simply by adding compost. And so in the case of this farm that goes with the compost operation, they had bad soil because it's an urban farm in an area that has had a lot of erosion, a lot of construction over the years. But they were able to, they farmed for several years, and it was difficult to make the urban farm viable until they started applying compost to the farm. So there's a layer that's put on the farm before planting begins in the spring, and they've just completed that process for this year. And they've been, growing in greenhouses over the winter, and so now things are beginning to flourish on the actual farm. But some farmers obviously don't use compost; they use either chemicals or other types of organic additives. But most soil deficiencies can be cured through the use of compost. And again, that's just a wonderful thing that God gave us the capability to do.
Yeah. Yeah, and it minimizes waste. I mean, that's a connection with
Hmm.
thrifting is, and don't
Yeah,
put your stuff into literally the dumpster to rot forever. Like,
absolutely.
actually get some
Yeah,
more use out of it.
right.
Before we go on to our last topic in our trifecta of stewardship topics today, um, give me real quick a sense of how much food we waste in America. Do you have a stat or two off the top of your head on this?
So approximately a third of what's in the typical landfill is food waste. One
A
third
third of what goes to the
of
landfill?
what is in the landfill is food waste. So let me give the average family or individual, any type of household, an exercise. Just at some point in time, if you're not involved in composting, don't know anything about it, just take your trash and dump it on the floor, in the garage, whatever the case may be, and set aside everything that can be composted, set aside everything that can be recycled, and see what you have left. And what you'll find is you have very little left. And if you're able to redirect in a positive way 90% or more of your trash, that's what zero waste is. And most people could do that if they simply looked at three channels of things that I'm getting rid of instead of only two. Because, when I was young, recycling was still a thing. So we chose whether or not to do it, And so I signed up for recycling, and then I had this little tub, that I kept in my garage and threw the plastic in, or whatever the case may be. Now it's not an option anymore. It's run through my HOA. And it's essentially mandatory, if you will. Now, some people do it responsibility and some people don't. Some people just feel like they have two trash cans. But you have your trash, your recycle, and then it's kind of a change in mindset. We have a third one, and so the third one is food waste. And so, there is no away when you're throwing something away, and it's simply going to a landfill because it's entering an anaerobic process where it's not being processed naturally the way God intended. And so that's when you get all these environmental things about gases and all that stuff. And for me, I try and
Yeah.
depoliticize this and just make it a creation care thing that we should be doing.
Yeah. All right. We have spent most of the time we have together talking about thrifting and composting, and honestly, I feel like I could keep going and have more questions. But I do want to round out this
Okay,
particular podcast episode, and maybe we could have you on for another episode
sure.
sometime. And I'm really interested in regenerative farming. That's something
Hmm.
that's becoming more popular in
It
international
is.
development circles,
It is.
and in the United States. But there's a
Hmm.
great nonprofit called called Plant with Purpose.
Hmm.
So maybe, Tony,
Know
maybe we
them.
could have someone with Plant with Purpose on the show,
Sure.
and you and I could interview them about their work. That would maybe be really fun. Okay,
That would be awesome.
philanthropic. Let's just try to make that happen. Philanthropic advising is the third thing. So what I'm interested in is how we can tie these three things together: thrifting, composting, philanthropic advising.
Sure.
And I think in philanthropic advising, we talk a lot about wealth. We talk a lot about
Hmm.
surplus wealth. Um, I don't know if I don't know if the right framing is wealth goes to waste in the same way food does,
No.
but mm, but you're saying no. I'm wondering there's certainly in the ecosystem, philanthropic ecosystem, things that feel to me to be somewhat wasteful. Whether
Hmm.
that's the $450 billion in donor advised funds that's allocated, earmarked for philanthropy, but not yet dispersed, the $1.6 trillion in private foundations. So there's $2 trillion earmarked for philanthropy that is not yet dispersed to nonprofits that are working on the ground. So,
Hmm.
like when we talk about your case of the organization that was stocking up, even surplus cash
Hmm.
reserves in the short run,
Hmm.
and then but did end up actually
Hmm.
spending all of that,
Hmm.
you know, that $2 trillion I just talked about is actually
Hmm.
before nonprofits
Hmm.
receive the money at all. So it does
Hmm.
not include the money in nonprofits' reserves, cash reserves.
Hmm.
It does not
Hmm.
include the university and hospital endowments, because universities
Hmm.
and hospitals, generally speaking,
Hmm.
are 501c3s. So those
Hmm.
endowments are managed by these 501c3s. There's $2 trillion that are pre
Hmm.
nonprofit, that are currently being stored. And I think there's a tension here when talking about wealth and stewardship, because I think there are two different ways the word stewardship gets used. One is we talk about stewarding wealth and we say things like, never touch the principal, this thing should grow forever. And that's what it means to be a good steward. I'm skeptical of that interpretation. And I think even in looking at some of the other examples you gave, there's this other idea of stewardship of use it all creatively to serve the community, to
Hmm.
do good, put it to use. And there is an element of creativity, of due diligence, of care that is part of that process. And I think all of that makes for a good philanthropist, like to be. But there's also this element of let's make the most out of this for the good of the community. You're welcome to disagree with me, Tony, by the way, on any of this. If I, but I almost feel like the way you're talking about stewardship in the context of thrifting and in the context of composting, like if we take that same idea and use it to talk about wealth for people who have more wealth than they'll ever spend in their lifetime, for example, or stored charitable assets, to me, the application is put it to use. Give it
Hmm.
to nonprofits and do that with a great deal of care. Hire a
Hmm.
philanthropic advisor. We
Hmm.
believe in that. Hire if you're in
Hmm.
Kansas City, hire Tony. He will help you put it to good use. But um what do you think? Do you think there is something um and what I just said, or anything that you would push back on? Am I being uncharitable in my interpretation of these piles of
Well,
wealth?
I think there's a lot of things going on, and I trust, I hope we can, we should trust the Lord that all these things that are swirling around, all these resources are going to be used in the way that He wants them to be used. So,
Yeah.
um, sometimes, nonprofits say God's will, God's bill, right? So, uh, that means that
Oh, that's a good line, Tony. I
when
haven't
an
heard that.
organ when an
That's good.
organization is ready, and when God knows they're ready, He's going to provide the resources that they need to do the
Mm,
mission that He wants to do. And I think we
mm,
should trust in that first. And so that's one way that I would think about it. Another way is simply connecting dots. So
mm.
there are a lot of extremely generous people, millions of extremely generous people that have
That's right.
put a tremendous amount of resources in the nonprofit world into for-profits that are doing social good. They could be social enterprises, B Corps, or whatever the case may be. So it's not even just the nonprofit world. There's a lot of social good for-profit organizations that are being supported through different types of donations as well. But what I love to think about, when I was in thrift, there's millions and millions of tons of clothing that's circulating, right? And God puts it where he wants it. Certainly we, as people, we make mistakes. We're not always as good stewards as we could. Things get thrown away. There's a giant pile of clothing that's massive, unbelievably massive in the Atacama Desert in Chile. Excess clothing that has come from first world countries that sits in the desert in Chile. Okay, it's just pure excess. Now, I think that as Christians, we're supposed to be responsible with money, and part of that is saving. And in my own mind, I'm always trying to reconcile that approach with, what was going on in Acts, selling everything and sharing it with the poor and all the common resources, that existed in the early Christian community in Acts. And so I try and reconcile that in my own mind, because as across the board, we have excess food, we have excess funds, we have excess stuff. So what are we supposed to do with it in the most God honoring way? And nonprofits have to build capacity. They have to scale. They have their own pinch points. They have their own mental capacity. If somebody's out there providing counseling and we gave them the money to provide counseling to 1,000 people instead of 100 people, they may not be ready, but God will make the funds available when he's ready. And so I hope we can take that approach, and that will apply to new transitional housing programs or new affordable housing programs or new forms of, prison ministry, food pantries, whatever the case may be. So
Yeah.
we get to watch.
Yeah. I think that's wonderful, Tony. And there is a sense in which, thinking back about Blessings Abound, for folks who are stewarding wealth, whether in a donor advised fund or a private foundation or in their own
Hmm.
personal portfolio, um, when you were thinking about hiring people who might otherwise not be able to have jobs, and to
Hmm.
have actually part of the economic engine of Blessings Abound be a
Hmm.
blessing to
Hmm.
this population, I think
Hmm.
there's something to that in the growing faith driven investing movement of,
Hmm.
you know, I've heard of one private foundation that was giving lots of money to research to cure chronic diseases, or
Hmm.
such as those that are caused by people who use tobacco
Hmm.
products. And
Hmm.
at the same time, their investment portfolio, they were investing in tobacco companies. And,
Sure.
and they did the math, and they were investing more into tobacco companies than they were giving to the research to heal the
Hmm.
chronic diseases. And I think that is one example of, they corrected that in their portfolio and they reallocated
Hmm.
their assets. But that's a kind of stewardship to me as well, of
Hmm.
saying, how can we take the care and the attention and to do the most we can with what we have.
Hmm.
And it doesn't mean giving everything away necessarily.
Hmm. That's right.
It might, but but it doesn't necessarily
Hmm.
mean that absolutely. And there are plenty of cases of scripture where people do not give away
Hmm.
everything that they have. But
Right.
if there is a error, I think, in our world today, it is with this kind of extravagant excess,
Hmm.
and a tremendous amount, frankly, of wastefulness.
Hmm.
I mean, I think to me, the thing that makes me the most uncomfortable when I look at the landscape of charitable assets is when I see money in donor advised funds that is not being granted and it's not being invested. It's stored
Mhm.
in cash in donor
Mhm.
advised funds.
Mhm.
And it's not even growing. It's diminishing in
Mhm.
value because of inflation.
Mhm.
Um, that would be like, okay, like, oh goodness, like uh, just put it in some, some
Mhm.
index funds or something.
Sure.
And But even better, find some social enterprises that you can fund with those investment
Mhm.
dollars and
Mhm.
actually fund social enterprises with your donor
Mhm.
advised fund. You use a tool like Impact Foundation and then grow
Mhm.
it and then grant it to nonprofits as you see that need and
Mhm.
capacity and as you have the capacity to do the work of
Mhm.
philanthropy. So
So I think
yeah,
there's lots of things going on there. I think that there are cases where we're simply providing charity. There are
yeah.
populations that are not going to be self-sufficient. We shouldn't call them out to go out and get a job and take care of themselves. We're going
Mm,
to be taking care of those populations, and we should do that, for God's glory. Um, there are cases where people should be able to make a living doing something, and it shouldn't necessarily have to take place in a nonprofit structure. So, and I think farming, in his example, you're talking about regenerative farming. There's 900 million acres of farmland in the United States. Slightly under 2% are farmed regeneratively. And so as you mentioned, there's a lot of efforts going on internationally around large scale composting, soil replenishment, like millions of acres in other countries that is not taking place a lot in the United States yet. And there are programs to teach people how to farm regeneratively. So then the question is, should that be done under a nonprofit structure, or should they be taught and be able to make a living as a farmer? And I think we need to recognize that both of those exist. There are roles for nonprofits to serve vulnerable populations, and there are roles for supporting for-profit structures to help people become viable in a profession, particularly those that have some social good.
yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree. There are places for nonprofits, places for businesses. Both of these vehicles and organizational types can promote human flourishing and are necessary for a healthy society. As we are wrapping up today, Tony, I wanted to, and we just had a weird glitch of audio too, so we're gonna fix that. But so our listeners probably, hopefully, will not be too interrupted by that weird glitch we had. But wrapping up, this is a podcast about love, about what it means to love like Jesus. And we've talked a lot about not wasting stuff, about making the most with what we have, and this concept of stewardship and being a responsible steward. And so I'm going to put these two questions together. Two questions for you. What does stewardship have to do with love and how we love our neighbors? And then also, what are you learning in this season of life about what it means to love like Jesus?
Mhm. Mhm. Good question. Um, so I'm thinking of stewardship and loving like Jesus in several ways. I think one is um, would be self care. Am I taking care of myself so that I'm the best I can be to speak on faith, to encourage others? Do I have opportunities to help disciple others as I'm being discipled myself? Um, I think we need to steward our emotions. We need to steward our words. Our tongue can do so much damage or so many wonderful things at the same time.
Mm,
All those things need to be stewarded. And loving like Jesus is certainly a reflection on his sacrifice, um, and stewarding as it relates to our renewal and the resurrection. Um, and all those things. We're either in the world or we're in the Word, one or
Mm.
the other. And certainly there are lots of times I'm in the world for various reasons, and hopefully my sins are forgiven every day. Um, but spiritual disciplines of being in the Word, having time for reflection, serving other people, praying, worshiping, all those things that as spiritually maturing Christians, we want to try and do every day. And our love for the Lord is best reflected in those disciplines, and recognizing it's His will, not our will. And how are we discerning the doors that are open for us? Which ones are we going to walk through, based on what God wants us to do and how He wants us to serve, as a Christian.
The invitation to grow this week is to donate some of your extra stuff to a thrift store that supports a local nonprofit in your community. Thank you so much to Tony for joining me on the show. If you have feedback on this episode, you can reach me at brian@simplecharity.org. Next time on the show, a conversation about what we can learn from the Lord's Prayer about caring not just about our neighbor's eternity, but also about their lives here on this earth. Have a great week. See you next time.